Did I miss anything?
I think you got it.
All right, Rachel, go ahead.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, so I'm gonna introduce Sarah Grace. She has some really wonderful experiences that I'll share with everyone. So she's a first-year PhD student in the Clinical Community Psych program at the University of South Carolina. Sarah Grace graduated with honors in the spring of 2020 with a BS in psychology from the College of William and Mary, where she was an active member in queer student groups and advocacy groups for LGBTQ+ equity on campus. Her research includes the promotion of health equity in communities that have been historically underserved by health systems. And she's also interested in how community organizations, especially faith organizations, can promote health and wellness with marginalized communities. She's interested in addressing disparities in health and wellness through research and research-informed policy change. And she's particularly interested in policy related to rural health, Black health, and U.S. international policy as it relates to refugee health. So lots of really amazing kind of breadth to what she does already, even though she's just sort of beginning her doctoral study. So we're very excited to have her and to learn from her. So Sarah Grace, we'll let you take it from here. And as Ashley said, we'll come back to questions in the chat after you're done speaking. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Okay, can you all see this? Okay, great. That was a great introduction. I don't feel like I have too much to add. I do want to give some background about where this presentation, this sort of project initiative came from before I begin, and then give you some insight into like the project itself. So this began as a social advocacy project for one of my classes, which was like an introduction to community psychology. And we were encouraged to pick advocacy projects that meant something to us. And this is a topic that is pretty close to me and my own experiences and those within my communities as well. So I'm excited to be sharing it with you today. So the first thing I'd like to do is discuss some terminology relevant to this discussion, just so we're all, like, all on the same page. I know we're bringing different knowledge to this conversation. I want to give you all some understandings of like common transgender experiences within academic spaces. The way that I was able to develop this presentation was pretty collaborative. As Rachel said, I just recently came from undergrad, so I still have a lot of connections with queer student groups on campus, and many of those people are my friends. So a lot of the conversations I'm going to be sharing with you are coming directly from 7 collaborators that I had that chose to remain anonymous. And then transgender online forums that I'm a part of as well. And I want to share information about how to best approach pronoun sharing and disclosure within academic spaces with you all for making a space that's welcoming and authentic, but not coercive or threatening. And then how to gracefully make mistakes and be an advocate for transgender students. Another thing is, if you feel comfortable, you can unmute yourself. I have sections built in that are going to be a little bit more discussion based if you all are comfortable with that. So yeah. Okay, the first thing I want to start with is some terminology. So I'm going to be, let me move this little Zoom thing. I'm going to be conceptualizing gender within this presentation as 3 sorts of things: gender as a system, gender as an identity, and then gender as an action, as something that you do. However, these are not the only ways that gender can be conceptualized. I want to make that clear. So gender as a system historically was based on a person's sexual phenotype, and they were classified as one of 2 genders according to that phenotype. And gender assigned at birth is what I'm going to be, is a phrase I'm going to be using to refer to those genders that are assigned based on sexual phenotype. a cisgender person is someone who identifies with the gender that they were assigned at birth, and their gender identity corresponds with that. There's no dissonance there necessarily. And transgender people are those, for the most part, who do not have an identity that corresponds with the gender that was assigned at birth. And I might be using terms like binary transgender people or non-binary transgender people in this conversation. Binary transgender people are those whose gender identity does not correspond with the gender assigned at birth, but rather it corresponds to that of the opposite of like binary gender. So a trans man or a trans woman might be considered binary. But someone can also be a trans man and experience gender as non-binary. And this is identifying with a gender that is not the one that you were assigned at birth, but a gender that is also not that like opposite binary gender. We'll talk about that more later. And just a quick note about gender non-conforming people, and those are people who don't conform to gender presentation. Some of them identify as transgender, and some of them do not. Let me check the chat. It's kind of difficult to see the chat. So if you have any questions, I'll try and answer them. But if someone can let me know if there's a question, that might be helpful.
I'll let you know, Sarah Grace.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, gender can also be defined as sort of a set of actions, because gender as an identity is sort of an internal experience of self, but doing gender is more of this externalization of an internal truth. So this performance of someone's gender is what gives it meaning to other people outside of a psychological experience, and can be really validating, especially for transgender people, to feel that they're living their internal experience. So there's coming out, which is one way of doing gender, and it's sort of a declarative acknowledgement of one's queerness to other people. And coming out is sort of a perpetual process, and I'll be talking about that a little bit. And then transitioning is an action of reintegrating into the role of one's true gender from the gender that they were assigned at birth. Yeah, so many trans people seek to transition so that they can be better recognized as their true gender, because this can be really empowering and lead to transgender people feeling like they're being heard and that they have power over their own situation and identity. But there's also risk involved, and there are higher rates of homelessness in transgender people and in transgender youth specifically than in cis counterparts. Transgender people experience hiring discrimination and healthcare discrimination. Many of these policies which allow for this, there were bans on hiring discrimination and healthcare discrimination that were stripped by the Trump administration. So I'll be interested to see how those change within the next few years. At least as of November 2020, at least 40 identified transgender people had been murdered in 2020, most of whom were trans women of color. And trans people experience higher rates of depression, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide. And much of this comes from the way that society and gendered expectations play out within different ecological systems within a transgender person's life. I'll be conceptualizing this through the eyes of a transgender student. So transgender undergraduate students navigate a lot of different spheres of their lives. First of all, the family, and whether they feel comfortable being out and presenting their gender to their family is a personal choice that transgender students have to make, and that's balancing one's identity, being validating, empowering, improving mental wellness, but also like shielding someone from harm of rejection if they choose not to come out. The same thing for within schools and classrooms, activities they choose to be a part in. Spiritual settings might have specific expectations for gendered performance that transgender people might not feel comfortable with, or might feel especially validated if they're accepted in those spaces, and neighborhoods and housing. And then within healthcare, within employment, university administration has a large role in how transgender people are perceived by their professors and by those around them who have access to their records. And then cultural norms, broader policy, and things like patriarchal and cis heteronormative societal structures really leave a lot of room for transgender people to decide when they want to come out and reveal themselves and their true experiences, and when they feel more safe staying closeted, we might say. Okay, and here are two ways that transgender people often perceive danger, and these are things that can be perceived as either minor slights or can lead to violence in some situations. So the weight that these things carry varies from person to person, but it's never a positive experience. So I want to talk about misgendering first, and this is the use of the wrong gendered pronoun. So someone might use he pronouns, but be called she, for instance. This is like misgendering. This is a consequence of the rigid nature of our language, especially like within the English language. This is something that we've all grown up with learning to assume one's pronouns by sight, usually based on these binary gender education that we've sort of all received. And this can be really harmful, especially for transgender people, because assuming pronouns by sight can lead to misgendering, which is sort of like outing someone when they would like to not be outed. It's also just really rude and a denial of one's identity. I also want to make clear, this is something that one of the students that I talked to said that I should point out, is that pronouns are not the same thing as gender. So a non-binary person might use they pronouns, but other people might also use they pronouns. And non-binary people can use other pronouns than they. It's not really important when having a conversation with a transgender person to know their identity in order to use their pronouns and demonstrate respect and recognition of one's identity. And then dead naming is using the name that was assigned at birth that a person might no longer use. And this might come up for you in classrooms when you receive like a roster from the school and it has someone's dead name on it. And I can talk about how to navigate this in just a minute. But does anyone have any questions about this so far? I want to be sure. I'm pacing myself. Okay, we good? Awesome. Okay. I also want to make a quick note about the word preferred, as in preferred pronouns. So I'm going to encourage you all to avoid using the phrase preferred pronouns if possible. I know sometimes this can be a really difficult habit to break, because when pronoun discussions started becoming more mainstream, I think preferred pronouns was how people started to use it first. But can anyone come up with a reason why the phrase preferred pronouns might not be exactly the one that like transgender students might like to hear?
It implies that the individual, there's a real pronoun, but this is their preferred pronoun.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So like you could use the phrase preferred to like describe like a pizza topping or something that's like more of an opinion. But one's pronouns is they're a representation of someone's inner truth. So it's not really a preference. This is similar to the phrase identify, which is something that some trans communities have been trying to phase out. I don't want to speak for all trans communities, but the difference between she identifies as a woman and she is a woman is just a difference of recognizing her identity as like truly valid and not just an internal experience. Okay, and then this is an example of how someone might introduce themselves with their pronouns. So like, my name is Sarah Grace, my pronouns are she and they. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move on to pronouns within the classroom. And here, if anyone wants to speak up, like throughout this section to speak to their experiences with navigating pronouns in the classroom, I would be very excited to hear some of your thoughts, but I've incorporated a lot of thoughts from current undergraduate transgender students that can help you to improve your allyship moving forward. Okay, so the first option for pronouns being addressed within a classroom is, I guess, that pronouns aren't addressed at all. And being a current graduate student and being an undergraduate, I've been in situations where pronouns were not addressed. And can anyone point to either a strength or a weakness of this approach?
I think a weakness could be that it marginalizes people.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Because if it's not addressed at all, then you're completely excluding people who would normally be identified out as male or female, the traditional binary concept, and not everyone fits into those two categories.
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it. Yeah, so transgender students, especially those who are non-binary or those who might not like pass, might not be assumed to be the gender that they actually are. And this can be really hurtful. This is the way that misgendering happens within the classroom. And this is a way to shut transgender students out of conversations because they don't want to voice their thoughts for fear of being called a pronoun that doesn't correspond with their identity. And then, of course, option 2, pronouns are addressed, and there are lots of different ways that I've seen pronouns be addressed within classrooms. And then there are some ways of addressing pronouns within classrooms that are more comfortable to transgender students than others. And I'm going to walk through some of those. But first, I want to ask you all about your experience with current pronoun etiquette. I've listed some examples that I can think of right now, just of like current pronoun etiquette that I've been a part of just within the last couple of years. So there's the obligatory pronoun circle, and this is transgender community language that I've heard to describe what happens when like a large group of people might stand in a circle, or they might just sit around. The pronoun circle is just sort of like a term to describe when people go around and introduce themselves with their names and pronouns. Like, my name is Sarah Grace, my pronouns are she and they. You might throw a fun fact in there. And then the pronoun name tag, which might have like my name, Sarah Grace, and then my pronouns, she, they. So why might someone initiate a pronoun circle? And then after that, we'll talk about what are the strengths and weaknesses of a pronoun circle. But why might someone initiate a pronoun circle?
Hi there, Theo here. One reason why people might initiate a pronoun circle is so that everyone gets a chance to learn everyone else's pronouns at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a good way for a professor to learn someone's pronouns and maybe take a quick mental note of like something that might be, challenging for them or for students to get to know one another. So let's talk about strengths and weaknesses of mandatory pronoun introductions really quickly before I share with you some things that transgender students have shared with me about pronoun introductions this way. But can anyone think of sort of potential strengths and weaknesses for mandatory pronoun introductions or these pronoun circles?
Sure. So I wonder, well, actually, let's start with the strengths, right? So I think that when you do a pronoun circle, it normalizes this conversation and allows everybody to share without somebody having to stand up and say you're misusing pronouns or you got my pronouns incorrect. While at the same time, there could be a possibility where somebody's not prepared to share their pronouns at that point in time, and so you're putting them on the spot where they have to make that decision at that moment.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. Does anyone have any other thoughts about like a potential strength or weakness?
I think it helps people who maybe aren't as familiar as to why this is important to help them acknowledge that it is important. Going off kind of the point that I was making earlier about like not marginalizing people. So it's just bringing like more awareness that this is a concern that people have, and especially to, help encourage not just education, but also a feeling of like inclusivity and comfort in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the big strengths of pronoun introductions this way.
Yeah, I think when I do this as part of like basic introductions and all in my classes, although this quarter I didn't, and I said I was sort of waiting for this discussion as part of trying to improve my own practice. But part of the reason I do it is part of the other introductory activities where you sort of learn about people's backgrounds too, is to try to create some kind of environment where people be respectfully referring to each other throughout the quarter when we talk in small group discussions. So trying to set a tone so that people feel that they have at least some respect in the way in which we have conversation throughout the quarter. That would be one potential strength if it works.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's a great point that these pronoun circles aren't just for the instructor, but also to make sure that students within the space, like if you're breaking into small groups, know how to refer to one another. So here's a quote from a conversation that I had with the trans students online. So they gave me permission to copy and paste this. They say it's a mixed bag, and they're referring to pronoun introductions and pronoun circles in class. If I feel safe in the space already, I'm comfortable and happy to share my pronouns. Typically, this isn't achieved in a class setting though. So I just choose not to share. I'm not out to everyone. So sometimes I feel pressured to identify myself where I prefer not to, and that pressure causes me anxiety. On the other hand, when no one bothers to ask and assumes what pronouns I may use, it's also frustrating. Outside of school, I rarely share my pronouns because folks don't often ask, and because I'm not out to roommates, my family, etc. Okay, so here are some concerns that some transgender communities online have identified with mandatory pronoun disclosure. The first is the question of safety and whether transgender people feel safe within a space. And often they can't make that decision on the first day of class. The question of whether they want to share their pronouns is often sort of conflated with the same thing as sharing their identity. And because often they're treated as one and the same, like I mentioned before, it can be really difficult for transgender students to decide whether it's too risky to share or not. So making pronoun disclosure mandatory sort of requires that some transgender students might out themselves before they're ready to do so. There's the spotlight effect, which is transgender students feeling like they've been made the tacit transgender spokesperson for the entire class because they're the only person who said they, them, or they are the only person who doesn't like quote unquote look like the pronouns that they shared. There's the questioning student. So this is a student who may be working through some of their gender identity, and by putting them in a situation where they are required to come up with pronouns to describe the experience that they're not even sure that they can describe quite yet, that can be really, really stressful. And then more concerns with mandatory pronoun disclosure. Some students in your classroom, especially cisgender students, aren't going to understand the importance of this activity, and some of them are going to make jokes about this. I mean, ideally, this wouldn't happen within like a community psychology classroom, but it's nice to move away from this mandatory pronoun disclosure so that like other students, cisgender students, aren't making jokes about like I identify as this or that in front of trans students, because that can make transgender students feel like it's not a safe space, which maybe it's not. The effects are often temporary of this sort of thing. Like when I TA, for instance, if we were to do this for my class of like 75 students, and I mean, that's a little extreme, but I'm not even going to remember everyone's names. So often what happens with these circles is everyone goes around, shares their name, their pronouns, and people are misgendered anyway. And that can be kind of invalidating for transgender people who felt like maybe this was the professor signaling that, oh, you're welcome in this space, but in fact, they're not quite ready to do that yet. And then there's this new binary, which is a concept that I've heard some transgender scholars talk about before, one of whom I cited, and I'll be sending a resource to an article about this new binary concept to you all after this, which is the idea that instead of the binary of men and women, by putting transgender people and cisgender people on the spot to explain their experiences, there's this new binary made of transgender and cisgender people, and there's no room for cisgender people to explore their gender identity, or for transgender people to feel like they're not like being put back into some sort of box. This isn't the experience of all transgender people, though. This can be a very validating conversation, as some of you were saying, for trans students who feel ready to disclose. So I don't want to discourage anyone from asking to do these sorts of things. I do ask that these are optional. This is still not perfect because there's still sort of a pressure if we're doing some sort of activity like this, even if you say that it's optional for people to include those pronouns because they've been mentioned. This also, I acknowledge, is pretty impractical for larger classes or lectures. I would say that vaguer questions might be a way to help with this, although I've never been in a situation where this has been used. So like, what's your name? What's your favorite genre of music? Or like anything else that you'd like to share with the class might be a space for someone to say, hey, I use like she, they pronouns as like, and anything else you'd like to share sort of item. However, I can't speak to the efficacy of that. I've actually never seen it done. And then the important thing when doing this, more important than necessarily the exercise itself, is ensuring that transgender safety is a class expectation before doing the sharing. You can do this by putting it in the syllabus that transgender experiences or pronouns personal identities are going to be respected in the space, and that while making mistakes are okay, we're going to work through those mistakes together and address those. They're not going to go unchallenged. Okay. Here's another quote. It says, many of my professors require people to share their pronouns as an icebreaker, such as giving a name, pronouns, why you took this class. I've also had others ask for them in a survey before the semester starts, which I much prefer. It is more comfortable for me personally. This is actually feedback that I got back quite a lot, was this survey option. Especially pre-class surveys are a really nice alternative to this, and allow for a little bit more flexibility in the questions that you ask. So some sample items could be like, what name should I call you? And then, you know, if this is linked to your university's Blackboard or Canvas, hopefully you can adjust the roster accordingly. And then, whoop, sorry. And then what pronouns should I use for you in class or in lab meetings or in those more public spaces? And then what pronouns should I use for you in office hours, emails, or other correspondence? While this distinction isn't necessary, it might be nice for transgender students to feel like, while they might not feel comfortable being out in these more public spaces, that you're still willing to respect their identity in office hours or in your email. And then, you know, what motivated you to take the class? Do you have any concerns? And then is there anything else that you'd like for me to know? Is a space for students that might not be transgender to share things with you, like I'm having like this health problem this semester, or I'm really excited about this topic. So this is a way to accommodate a lot of students, not just transgender students within your classroom. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list, though. I want to make sure that that's really clear, that I only have one experience and the people that I talk to only have one experience. And I'm sure that this has been done in other ways at other schools. So I'd be excited to learn more if any other people have seen different methods. Feel free to voice those or put those in chat. Okay, and then the last couple things I want to talk about is that pronoun recognition within the classroom and respecting pronouns and personal identities is necessary, but not sufficient to make sure that transgender students might feel incorporated and included into your class. So you want to make sure that you're establishing your educational space as gender affirming, and that requires some building on the part of the professor, just acknowledging that the professor has the power to set some of these community values for your class. So be open and be willing to correct someone within your class and to be corrected yourself if misgendering has occurred, and this requires some humility. But I'll talk about ways to gracefully make mistakes after this. Another way to make sure that transgender students feel comfortable is signposting, and that's disclosing your own pronouns. I'm going to be talking about how to do this right. And then I also want to end with a note about discomfort. Okay, so how to make a mistake with Grace and Poise. The first thing is to recognize and apologize for the error, and then quickly correct yourself. Like if you have used he instead of they, just quickly correct yourself and then move on. And continue talking about what you were talking about without drawing more attention to the error, because the longer it sits within that conversational space, the more disheartened a transgender student or a transgender colleague might feel. And we want to avoid that. So don't fixate on the mistake, don't apologize profusely, because transgender students don't want to make you feel like guilty. They're not trying to shame you. This is just something that makes them more comfortable and live more authentically. And then don't spend extra time justifying why you made the mistake. Like, oh, sorry, this is new to me, or, oh, like I knew you before you used these pronouns. Like, please just avoid doing that. Also, even transgender people make mistakes, so please don't feel shamed yourself when making a mistake. This is about striving to get used to these sorts of ways of respecting people so that we can be better for transgender people. And then here's how to correct others with grace and poise. It's very similar to the last one. Think about a context appropriate way to correct them, quickly correct them, and then continue on with whatever you were doing. Once again, don't fixate on the mistake or shame the other person, but also, and this is important, don't feel the need to continue a conversation that turns hostile. So if you're getting a lot of pushback from one individual, especially if they're a student, that's a conversation that is better held not within class, especially in front of a student that may have just been misgendered. We want to avoid that. Okay, and then here's signposting. And this is an act of disclosing your own pronouns to signal to transgender people that you're an ally and that this space might be safe for them to be out in. Signposting can often be done through sharing your own pronouns, either in speech, like when you've walked into class. I mean, not that we're walking into a lot of classrooms right now, but also within the syllabus, an email bio. One student that I talked about, like, one of the real strengths of having class on Zoom is the ability to put your pronouns in there with your name. That's really useful for a lot of trans students, but it's great if professors set that precedent as well. And this just goes to normalize the practice of pronoun sharing outside of just queer spaces. But a quick note, just as pronoun disclosure shouldn't be mandated for students, especially transgender faculty or staff should not be pressured or mandated to disclose any parts of their identity, pronouns included. Okay, lastly, I want to encourage you to familiarize yourself with resources for trans students that are available on campus. Some of these might include student ID assistance. So changing a student's name was something that was really, really difficult for students to do. And within, like at William and Mary, for instance, and I know that this is the case for other places. So knowing how those avenues work might be a good way for you to help transgender students if they ever come to you for help. Be knowledgeable about health services as they pertain to trans student needs, or any LGBTQ like campus alliances or support groups. Be able to point a transgender student to counseling if needed, and then know the phone number or an email for someone in a diversity office or Title IX might be ways that you can help a transgender student if they come to you for advice related to their identity and navigating academic spaces. And then finally,
Grace.
Yeah.
Oh, we have a quick question in the chat. What does a context appropriate way to correct mean? Do you have any examples of how that would work?
Yeah, let me come up with an example that I've seen before. Yeah, so like, let's say that everyone's sort of sitting around a table. This might be in class, or like you're leading a group discussion. And there's a student, like pronouns are only used really in the singular third person. And this person might say, oh, well, she made a great point, you know? And like, before they move on to talk about other things, just quickly say, yeah, the point that they made was great. That might be a more subtle way to do it, but if it's becoming a recurring problem, you could say, did you mean they? And then quickly move on from that as best you can. I mean, again, if it's becoming a thing where it's becoming drawn out because there's pushback, it might be best to let that go, talk to the transgender student afterwards to see if they're doing okay, and then reach out to the student who might need help in understanding why this is important to another person. Does that answer the question? I want to be sure.
Michelle, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did.
Yes,
Thanks.
it did.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you for asking. Oh, and then I want to encourage people that it's okay to be a little bit uncomfortable, but moving towards comfort and not knowing, and being okay with maybe not knowing everything about the students that are coming into your classrooms is one way that you can be a more open person to transgender identities, and can also sort of help you be more welcoming to transgender people as well. Is transgender students might come in and out of your classrooms and not feel ready to share that part of their identity with classmates. And that's completely fine. And as a professor, it's, or as an instructor in general, it might be really difficult because you want to be able to accommodate everyone. You want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable. But some transgender students are going to feel ready to share their pronouns and some of them won't. So being comfortable in that ambiguity is just a piece of advice that I can give. But I know that's really difficult. Okay, and then I also want to say that what I've presented is by no means perfect, and there's no one way that transgender students are. And I am one person, I don't have all of the answers, but also the best practices are likely to change. The best practices of pronoun sharing are likely to change through time. So recently, transgender students have raised concerns about pronoun circles, especially those that are mandated as being maybe not as accommodating as people think that they are. And as those voices grow louder and transgender acceptance and visibility becomes more commonplace, those conversations might shift in a completely different direction that I haven't introduced. I don't know. So I'm excited to follow this. I encourage you to find some transgender scholars or follow transgender people either online or at your university to see what happens next and be comfortable in not knowing that as well. Okay, and then right before questions, I want to give a really huge thank you to the students that guided me in building this resource. And although they chose to be kept anonymous, I want to recognize their vulnerability and conviction and the power that they brought to this conversation. I'm also going to be sending references for this presentation in like a separate Word document in an email after this that I think Rachel mentioned at the beginning. Yeah. But here's a moment for questions, and I also want to acknowledge the time.
Let's give a round of applause to Sarah Grace too before we forget for this amazingly informative presentation. Thank you. You can unmute yourself if you want, or just do this, the sign. So Ashley, did you put questions in a document that came up earlier? Because I saw a couple earlier, but I'm not sure, or should we just move forward?
So I did keep some. I think you answered some of them along the way, but let's see if anyone has questions to start, and then we can revisit that list.
Or comments, of course.
I have a comment. Love the presentation, Sarah. Thank you so much. One thing I wanted to bring up is one of the most useful surveys I ever had a professor do. It's said something along of like, let me know your pronouns if you want, and feel free to update me if these change throughout the quarter. That was like really significant because for a lot of trans and non-binary people, their pronouns might shift, especially people, there's gender fluid people who they might use different pronouns day to day. So it's important to let students know that it's all right if they change. Feel free to inform me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's brilliant. I've never had a professor do that before, but I wish I had, because not only does that accommodate gender fluid people, but people who are slowly deciding whether or not a space is safe to be out or not. I think that's really great. Thank you for sharing that.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Sarah Grace. This was such a fabulous presentation. I had a question about if you have maybe any thoughts, or if anyone here has thoughts on if there are ways to maybe manage, if, like, let's say you're in a situation. I'm thinking, obviously, if I was teaching a class, that would be a different power dynamic, but I've sometimes been maybe a bystander in another group where there is a mandatory pronoun circle. Is there something that, as, someone who would be comfortable sharing my pronouns, but is there something we can do to kind of maybe disrupt that, to just make it a little bit more open or comfortable, I wonder?
Yeah. So I've also definitely been in this situation. For context, one of the reasons why I made this presentation was I'm generally pretty uncomfortable the first day sharing my own pronouns. And it was mandated at the beginning of my first semester as a graduate student in almost every class. And I didn't feel that I had the power then to say anything as the activity was beginning. But it's really great if you are within that situation, if you observe a pronoun circle beginning, to just shout out if you feel comfortable. Or, if you'd like to share. These are ways that can sort of take the responsibility that's sort of thrust on people to share their identities, take a little bit of the edge off, like I was talking about. But if you're mid pronoun circle, that might be more difficult. I actually have not been in a space where it's been disrupted mid circle, but I would be interested in hearing other people's experiences and thoughts with this.
I think I actually did that this quarter. I said in the beginning that, I think I said this today even, that this is the first time I didn't actually have it be like a mandatory thing, but I said you're also, I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but it wasn't a mandatory thing. But as students started, I also said, you're also welcome to share your pronouns, but it's not mandatory. But I kind of added it in as I noticed that some students just offered it and some students didn't, and I followed their lead a little bit in doing it. So I think you're welcome to throwing it out. It worked fine. And actually, but then everyone did proceed to share their pronouns after that, which was interesting. So a student kind of set the tone this time for the first time in all the quarters that I've done this. But can I just add one quick comment to what Erin was saying and what Sarah Grace has said? One thing I'm just thinking about is the sort of context dependency of all of this, and like really knowing our university and classroom settings really well. And kind of, so for example, for where I teach, I think the pronoun circle has only become a normalized practice in the last year or two. It's not something we've been doing for 5 years or 10, as some of the other spaces have done. So I'm also wondering, I don't know if other people have thoughts about this, or maybe it's just to elevate what you said at the end, Sarah Grace, that that all students are different, and you kind of have to be able to sort of really have a sense of what your students need in each class, that it's going to be different from class to class, but also that from our university spaces, there might be a lot of variation. What do you think about this? And like that the idea that, I don't know, that we might really have to make some different assessments depending on the region, because a lot of my students are still very new to thinking about and understanding the complexity of gender identity development generally. So I don't know, what do you think about that thought is a question I have. In terms of, because are these norms we should be setting, is because we're sort of going against norms in a sense, and then, but also providing other, so it's just a thought I had, I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it does. I think it does. And I'll share like my thoughts about this, but I don't want to like represent this as like, like a new best practice or anything. So I grew up in rural Appalachia, and these conversations, while I, within the last like 5-6 years have identified as transgender, these were new conversations to me when I entered undergrad. And, the first time that I had to introduce myself with pronouns was kind of tricky, because like I had like experiences and feelings around this that like I had never explored before. So students that might be coming in that are cisgender who've never had experience with this might be really like confused as to what the point of this is. I think in order to set community expectations around this with whatever method of pronoun sharing you choose to go with, there should be some sort of disclaimer about this is to make people feel comfortable. I guess it's up to you to make that as like explicit as you want, whether it's about, I want to make sure that transgender and non-binary students are feeling welcomed within this space, or this is what being transgender and non-binary means for students that might not know what that is. And I think that that might also be a strength of the survey approach, is to have like a little note within like the survey about like, why are we doing this? You know what I mean? I don't know if that fully answers your question though.
I think so. Thank you. Yeah, Marcia.
Oh, thank you. It seems to me, and this may have something to do with your question, I don't know. It seems to me that we really do have two quite different problems. And one is a problem that our language requires us to mark gender in situations where gender may very well be irrelevant, where that's not the central aspect of identity that a person is wanting to communicate, and yet our language requires us to mark gender there. That's one problem. Then we have the different problem of our tendency to assume gender based on some aspect of appearance that we think we know. So we think we know somebody's gender based on what we see. And those seem to me to be pretty different problems. And I'm not sure that some of the things that help help address one of those problems don't exacerbate the other. So when we do this pronoun introductions, we're making gender be a critical part of identity in this situation where gender might really be irrelevant to what we're doing today at this moment.
I definitely hear what you're saying, and I think that that is a good point. It is, for transgender people, often this experience of, I think a lot of transgender people wish that their gender felt as irrelevant as it should be within the moment. I hope that makes sense, where almost as a prerequisite to existing within a space, doing like work within a classroom, and getting to the point where they feel comfortable like sharing other parts of themselves, their thoughts, or their opinions, their ideas. They want to make sure that they're respected as a person first. And I think this can be really difficult because you're right, for most students in your class, most likely, their gender is very irrelevant to them and to their experience. I think that because pronoun circles do center on gender, that is like one of the problems that it does set, is this like precedent that we're all going to share something that for cisgender students is pretty inconsequential, but for transgender students, likely they've spent a lot of time thinking about. And it's sort of, it's not equitable, this like sharing of emotional work that comes with sharing something like that. I don't know if that like directly answers your question. Does that sort of help?
Yeah, but then there's this other problem of us making assumptions about the other person's gender based on what they happen to look like today.
Yeah, and that's.
And I don't know if this gender pronoun thing disrupts that. Does it? I mean, maybe. Yeah, maybe it does.
I think this sort of a question that I was wondering that I thought maybe might come up here is, well, maybe we should just all default to like the singular they to be inclusive. And there are a lot of complex feelings around this, and like I have my own personal feelings about this, but they're defaulting to the singular they might help some trans people, but not all trans people feel validated too. So it is like a barrier in language that it's going to take a lot more work than us as instructors or professors are going to be able to provide, because like no one solution is going to work for all people.
I think we may have to go in a few minutes for another meeting. I wanted to just thank Sarah Grace again and really highlight your call for us to be thoughtful, I think, more than anything, about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and really creating, safe spaces for our students, and also to continue to learn ourselves, right? Like, what are the sort of best practices that have been researched and thought about, because it's ever changing. I also wanted to say that our next meeting will be focusing on anti-racist pedagogy, and also having a showcase, a speaker sharing particular strategies that they have used for long periods of time in the classroom, that have been really thoughtful and within sort of the values of community psychology. Sarah Grace is going to share resources, right, with folks, and I am sure Sarah would be happy to be contacted again for folks who have questions, emailed with other questions, or just to continue the discussion. Thank you so much again. One more round of applause. And thank you all so much for being here. It's been really a wonderful conversation today. So we hope to see you. Ashley, when is our next meeting? February?
So our next meeting is 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific, February 19. Make sure if you did not get your email address in the chat that you send that to me.